in that. Yes, we talked about sort of vagaries of management in England with regard to hardwoods. If you want to increase, or if you want to obtain a reasonably high proportion of quality hardwood timber in a stand, then you definitely need to have some sort of sustained management. Things do occur by chance, and you will get the odd decent stem. Very often, because of the long lifespan of these trees, of course, what tends to happen, you have periods of some activity and then long periods with no activity. And in order to get some sort of sustained management over a long period, it's quite unusual. It does happen on some of the big estates. But nothing quite like France, where you've got 200-year-old trees that have been in a management plan for that long since they were planted.
Right, yes.
We haven't got that. And it's partly because, again, I think of we've had a lot of change. We've changed structures. We've moved into a plantations phase, which we've not been able to sustain very often. World wars intervening. And so we haven't actually been able to sustain an approach to forestry over a long period. We've tended to move into this rather more intensive plantation approach, which we've not really been able to sustain, certainly in the hardwood sector. So again, what we're looking at this sort of approach is to try and get to something which is possible to sustain over a long period. Doesn't require large amounts of money at critical periods to make it work. That's what's the problem with plantations.
Yes, indeed.
If it works, it works. But there's a lot of times, it happens once, and then the next time you must put some money in. It's not there.
Right.
Lack of thinning,
right.
lack of tending with broadleaves.
Yes.
Inappropriate fellings at one point because perhaps we suddenly need a lot of money in one area, and we're all looking to take it all out of one area, rather than a more steady approach over a whole forest.
Right.
I think there is an issue in Britain in that we don't necessarily like to be told what to do, and we quite often like doing something completely different from the person next door. Certainly in France, it's very noticeable that people tend to be happy to do the same thing as the person next door. So, for example, if you've ever been to southwest France, you've got 1 million hectares that were afforested on heathland with maritime pine in the 19th century, largely privately owned in relatively small areas, but with very consistent management over a very large area. So I think there is something in that. We tend to like to be different and not want to do the same thing. When you add that to a very fragmented and heterogeneous resource, that does complicate matters a lot. I think it has led to quite a significant crisis, really, within hardwood production. I mean, you must have seen over your working life the actual available material from this country shrink.
One of the things I like about the scale we're working on is that we can relate to Andrew's situation in that we can use a specific butt with a particular project in mind. And that means that we're able to apply to timber the same kind of focus that he's applying to the management of those trees over generations. And that seems to be very much in line with the way you're working, that now a single tree becomes significant.
No, it is single tree working. You're absolutely right. I mean, that is a big difference. We're focused. It doesn't actually mean more work, it just means the whole focus of the approach is working tree by tree. We are not trying to create an area with a uniform characteristic, which is the agricultural approach, aiming to produce whatever the size of the stand is, a couple of hectares. The aim is to try and get something relatively uniform with an average characteristic which triggers the clear felling. Here we're actually trying to fill the stand with individual vigorous trees of best quality, and the removals are on an individual basis. So yes, and I think in the end it enables you to focus much more clearly on actually not just timber production, because the rules of felling which we apply make sure that we retain interesting trees, veteran trees, trees of minor species, trees with particular characteristics. Also the environment that we create within this productive high forest is actually very benign for those particularly interesting features, individual trees of particular importance. So that is, most of this forest, the broadleaf forest, is a site of special scientific interest. We're under a lot of scrutiny from Natural England, we generally get on well with them. This is very compatible. So, and it's worth saying that both at Melbury, which is a large-scale design landscape with the owner living there, and also here, which has very high nature conservation value, the amount of hardwood production will have increased significantly.
Right.
Because the alternative, which is large-scale cliff felling, has become less and less acceptable, and in many cases people don't know what else to do, so they tend to do nothing. So the hardwood production in most of my areas has gone up and has been sustained at a higher level than probably it would have been otherwise. But again, looking round at the quality, we've still got a stand of trees here which has got a fairly high proportion of second quality trees, and a lot of the trees here would never actually, I'm just trying to think, we've got a few big sycamore over there. A few of these trees you might be interested in.
Okay, let's take a look.
So as I've come through here, I've actually marked the sycamore, but that will be done next winter as part of a larger sale. Because sycamore has to be felled right in the middle of the winter, it doesn't fit easily in with the felling of everything else. So I will produce a specific sale of sycamore next autumn. Again, the buyers for sycamore tend to be completely different and specialists. I've been dealing with is a whole range of situations, from where the hazel is dominated at one end to planted areas like this where the high forest is dominant, and lots of integrates in between. And often that's the most difficult ones to manage. That is an interesting whole block where effectively we've gone from we've got most of that now filled up with young pole-sized trees. Perhaps we should have a little look in there. Mostly ash, by natural regeneration. So there's no planting in there at all. So there's 60 acres of naturally regenerated smaller sized trees there. But you need it 3/4 of the way round, don't you, really?
Yes. Preferably all the way.
Preferably all the way. You're very. I mean, this is just.
Very fine.
This is genetic. This is genetic. I mean, certain individuals do this. We don't think it's related to growing conditions. So it's not something we can actually influence by the stand structure. Fundamentally, what I'm doing is I am influencing which trees have most resources. So by removing this tree, this one, which has got a very nice long straight stem, will increase in diameter growth. So the bigger the crown, the faster in diameter the tree it grows. With a tree like ash also, there may be certain advantages in growing the tree faster. Its characteristics change if it's fast growing compared to slow growing in terms of diameter. So I am able to influence how individual trees grow by actually influencing the way in which the whole stand is. I can actually also influence how much light there is at this level, and that will also allow me to encourage natural seeding. At the moment there are too many trees in this little block here to actually have enough light down here to begin to get some natural regeneration. It's not only getting the trees to start germinating here, it's also to make them actually then rise up from here so they end up in the top. And we saw actually the area we first came in where there was a lot of this pole sage material. That means that that general area had a significantly lower number of trees 20 or 30 years ago. The trick is to get the right amount of light across this whole area so that you've got enough little trees coming up, enough space for the medium-sized trees to be able to eventually get up into the canopy, and at the same time to give enough space to the best trees in the stand.
Yes. So what it's effectively doing is giving you, is drawing the small trees up, but you need enough light to get them to germinate.
That's right. I mean, yes, absolutely. Because if they don't have enough light, particularly these species, oak and ash, will tend to start, rather than doing that, they'll tend to do that, or else they will not grow very vigorously. And the complication with oak and ash is that generally everything needs a bit more light. So the total number of trees that you end up with, or the total amount of biomass, will be a bit lower than with a species like beech, for example, which is able to do all these things at a lower light level.